So one of the things that people really want, especially those with insomnia, is deeper sleep. And I think what they mean by that is that they want to go to bed and not have all these awakenings, not feel like they're constantly tossing and turning, and not feel like they're in this sort of twilight zone of, am I really asleep? Am I really awake? And just want to be able to say, hey, like when I went to bed, closed my eyes, I fell asleep, and there was a concentrated block of time where I actually felt like, yeah, I was totally asleep during that time before I woke up in the morning. So in this video, I'm going to talk about some tips and tricks that I use as a behavioral sleep medicine specialist to actually help folks get some deeper sleep. If you don't know me, hi, my name is Dr. Parky. I'm a clinical psychologist and a behavioral sleep medicine specialist. I did my postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford's Sleep Health and Insomnia program, and I'm also the author of The Insomnia Paradox, which is a self-help book that talks about the CBTI strategies and how you can apply to your own unique sleep problems. So let's get on with the video. So first of all, it's important to know that sleep is not in and of itself a monolith, meaning that sleep is not all one thing. There's actually several levels to it. Like for example, when you're first awake and you start going into sleep, you go into sort of the lighter stage sleep first, stage 1 and stage 2, and then it isn't until about stage 3 that's where the sort of deep sleep that people are always thinking about, the thing that is sort of our recovery sleep. And then there's also kind of something called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. So there's sort of levels that we kind of go in and out of throughout the night. So I want to first normalize that little pockets of awakenings are quite normal, and people actually wake up a few times during the night. Sometimes they go to the bathroom, sometimes they quickly just toss to the other side. Usually we don't even remember it, especially those who are good sleepers, because their sort of arousal levels are so low, they don't actually register them into memory, these awakenings. But I do want to highlight that it's very normal to have these small awakenings in the middle of the night, but most people are able to fall back asleep pretty quickly. And when it comes to this sort of deep, slow wave sleep that people with insomnia always feel like they're missing, there's a couple components of it that is important. The first is that slow wave sleep happens more so in the first half of the night. So if you look at a chart kind of outlining how much sleep and different types of sleep people are getting throughout the night, there's actually sort of a over proportionate representation in the first half of the night where people are using up all of their sort of sleep need, so that the more of the recovery sleep is happening in the first half of the night, which is why it's sometimes harder when we wake up in the second half of the night to be able to go back to sleep, because we've used up a lot of our sleep drive and a lot of our slow wave sleep has already been utilized. And the second piece about slow wave sleep, which is related to a chemical byproduct in our brain known as adenosine, is that that's something that we can actually build up more and more throughout the day, so that when we get to the end of the night and we're trying to sleep, we can actually expend more of that adenosine to really, really get sort of more of that deep sleep that people feel like they're missing. So let's actually now talk a little bit about how we can get more deep sleep. So there's three main components that I often think about as a behavioral sleep medicine clinician as to how to make sure a person, when they go to bed, gets as consolidated, nicely timed sleep as possible. And the first one I've already mentioned is our sleep drive, our appetite for sleep. So this is where we can kind of talk about the difference between quantity of sleep and quality of sleep. So people often focus a lot on quantity, and sometimes at the expense of quality. Like they spend 9 or 10 hours in bed trying to get more and more sleep, but because of how much time they're spending in bed, they don't have as much time throughout the day to be up and at 'em and be active, which is actually what builds up that sort of byproduct, the adenosine in our brain, to allow for more of that deep sleep at night to unfold. So one tip is actually to make sure that even after a poor night, you're still not spending too much extra time in bed, you're still getting up around the same time, so that you have more time awake and active to build up that hunger signal for sleep, so that when you do go to bed, you can really cash in on all that extra sleep drive. So alongside the sleep drive, the other principle of sleep regulation is something called our circadian rhythm. And there's two sort of important factoids about the circadian rhythm that I think is important in the context of sleep. The first is that it's quite unique from person to person. So some people might be more early birds, some people might be sort of night owls, and you might already know yourself best if you were to think about what is kind of my feeling best rhythm, when do I usually feel the most awake, when do I used to feel kind of like a bit more sleepy, and that can be helpful to dictate when you should be going to bed and waking up. So if you're a bit more of an early bird, maybe you're going to bed around 10 and waking up at 5 or 6, or if you're a bit more of kind of an evening lark or night owl, you might go to bed a little bit later and wake up later. And generally speaking, obviously we need to take into account, societal factors, but generally speaking, following our circadian rhythm can be a good way to make sure that our circadian rhythm is working for us rather than against us. Because if you're trying to go to bed at 11, but your body clock isn't ready until 12 or 1, then even though you have a bit get higher sleep pressure, our circadian rhythm is not sending all that sleepy signals just yet. So following kind of a nice circadian rhythm in terms of timing with the sleep drive is going to be really helpful to increasing our ability to have nice consolidated sleep. And alongside the sort of timing of the circadian rhythm, it's also helpful from a regularity perspective, so that once you've chosen sort of a generally regular bed and wake up time, you stay pretty consistent within that frame. Obviously, if sometimes you want to just sleep in a little bit or, go to bed a little bit later because you're spending time with friends, that's totally cool. But generally on a day-to-day, to have a fairly regular circadian rhythm in terms of regularity of sleep and wake. And once you've kind of optimized your sleep pressure, the appetite for sleep, as well as your circadian rhythm, the last piece is to make sure you're going to bed in a state that's conducive to sleep. And what I mean by that is that sometimes people are like working until 11 and then immediately try to go to bed. And as you can imagine, like the sort of rumination and worries about work and the next day are probably all still there. So it's important to make sure that, you're giving yourself some protected time for rest and relaxation, maybe 30 minutes or an hour before bed to wind down, to make sure that you're going to bed in a state that feels right for you. And when it comes to what you can do to wind down, this is kind of just up to you, whatever you like. Like if you enjoy reading a nice book, that's awesome. If you want to read this book, it's actually not a scary book. Like sometimes I know like Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, for example, they tend to be a little bit spooky because they're like, oh my gosh, you need to sleep. And you're like, but I can't sleep. But that book tends to be pretty good in terms of really making sure it's quite lighthearted. Or you can listen to music, or you can take a nice bath. It can be whatever you want, just something that you know is quite enjoyable and will put you in the state of like, I feel relaxed, I'm ready for bed. So that's it. When it comes to getting higher quality deep sleep, you want to increase your sleep pressure, strengthen your circadian rhythm, and go to bed with relatively low levels of arousal. And I do really want to highlight, even if we increase sort of the sort of deepness of our sleep, so to speak, we do still go through different stages of sleep throughout the night. That is normal, and each stage of sleep have their own sort of function when it comes to supporting you and your well-being. So don't kind of think, oh, because I got so much more light sleep, that's necessarily like a horrible thing. That's in some ways quite important and quite normal as well. So just remember that, and hopefully these tips were helpful to make sure that your night is a little bit more consolidated towards your goals. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.